In a previous class, we examined the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the spread of ideas about commerce and the economic life of nations. In his influential book titled The Wealth of Nations, the 18th century Scottish economist Adam Smith provided a blueprint for the development of Western liberal capitalism. In this class, we will be assessing the impact of socialism, another economic system and political ideology, on the development of international human rights. Human rights ideas have historically been influenced by political ideologies. Liberal capitalism, which tends to be individualistic and egalitarian, emphasizes individual rights and liberties. Socialism, on the other hand, which tends to be state-centered and communitarian, emphasizes the sovereign rights of nations and the collective rights of peoples. In popular discourses, socialism has come to be associated with state control and restrictions of individual human rights. Socialist and Marxist contributions to human rights are often overlooked or dismissed. During the Cold War, socialism and communism came to be associated with authoritarian and repressive regimes. Marxism and socialism are therefore commonly seen as being antithetical to human rights because of the abuses of communist regimes such as the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union, the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, and the communist regimes in Maoist China, North Vietnam, and North Korea. However, the contribution of Marxist socialism and other forms of socialism to the development of international human rights should not be overlooked. It is important to recognize that just as ideas about free market capitalism have shaped notions of property rights, socialist ideas have also influenced human rights principles. Socialist movements and socialist countries contributed to human rights discourses at international forums, including the United Nations. Human rights scholars now recognize that the struggle for universal suffrage, workers' rights, and social justice, which are now principles endorsed in the major United Nations documents on human rights, were also shaped by socialist ideals and socialist movements. To understand socialist contributions to human rights, we must begin with a basic understanding of socialist principles. Socialism is a very broad concept, and there are many varieties of socialist ideas and movements. Generally, socialism refers to an economic theory of social organization that advances social or collective ownership and administration of the means of economic production. Socialism advocates the creation of an idealized egalitarian society where one's labor is the most important factor of production. Modern socialism originated in the late 19th century working-class political movement. 19th century German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels posited that socialism would be achieved through class struggle and a proletarian or workers' revolution, which represents the transitional stage from capitalism to communism. Among the early works that outlined socialist ideas from a Marxist perspective are the writings of Karl Marx in the books Capital, published in 1867, and the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. Marxist socialism puts workers at the center of economic production and the political system. Marxist theory of historical materialism conceives of history of human societies as being fundamentally determined by the relationships which people have with each other for producing and reproducing the means of human existence. This means that the relationship which people enter into with one another to fulfill their basic needs are driven primarily by economic needs. Karl Marx identified 6 successive stages of the development of these material conditions in Western Europe: primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and eventually communism. He postulated that capitalist conditions of the late 19th century, when he wrote, would eventually be replaced by socialism and later by communism. Karl Marx predicted that this change from capitalist to communist system would occur through class struggle, an uprising or revolution of the workers or the proletariat against oppressive capitalists or the bourgeoisie. The process of capitalism following the Industrial Revolution brought socialism to the forefront of 19th century struggles for human rights. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels argued that industrialization had increased the wide gap between the very rich and the very poor. Under these exploitative industrial conditions, they argued, the working proletariat provided the labor and the parasitic bourgeoisie or industrial capitalists gained from the industrial process. Marx and Engels therefore proposed a materialist understanding of rights, sensitive to economic forces, historical change, and conflicting class interests. They advocated workers' solidarity to take control of the means of economic production and the political system. They urged members of working classes throughout the world to cooperate to achieve victory in class conflict. In their book, The Communist Manifesto, they wrote the famous words, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." This slogan has become a political slogan for socialist and workers' rights movements around the world. Inspired by Marxist principles, socialist and social democratic parties rose across Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries, partly in response to the excesses of the Industrial Revolution. In 1864, socialists across Europe came together to form an international socialist organization called the Socialist International. This was the first international organization representing socialist movements worldwide. Its aim was to work together as socialists to develop policies and strategies for promoting political, social, and economic rights of workers and citizens. The socialist political movements that emerged around the world in the late 19th and 20th centuries focused on empowering workers and promoting workers' rights. Many of these socialist movements embraced a more inclusive and egalitarian agenda than one professed by liberals. Socialists advocated universal suffrage and the economic welfare of workers and other marginalized members of society. This concern for collective welfare is captured in the Marxist socialist slogan, "From each according to his ability and to each according to his needs." Socialist political organizations such as the Fabian Society in Britain advocated for labor rights and children's rights in response to the extensive use of child labor in industrial Europe. Socialist movements also advocated mass education in ways that resemble present-day activism for the right to education. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels called for recognizing the rights of children to free public education, the rights of children and juveniles, and these rights, they argued, should be affirmed and enforced by the power of the state. The 19th century Industrial Revolution and the growth of the labor movement opened the gates to previously marginalized individuals who challenged the classical liberal economic conception of social justice. Human rights historians have identified two main areas in which socialist principles and movements have shaped modern human rights. These include the collective right to self-determination of peoples and the right of nations to permanent sovereignty over their natural wealth and resources. The United Nations has not only adopted instruments dealing with the protection of individual human rights, it has also adopted important instruments and laws on the protection of the collective human rights of peoples. One of these collective rights is the principle of self-determination, which is the right of a people to freely choose their political systems and their path to socio-economic development. In the era of colonialism and imperialism, this was an important human rights claim. The right to self-determination is included in the United Nations International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which states that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and that by virtue of this right, they freely determine their political status and freely choose their economic, social, and cultural development. Delegates of socialist countries at the United Nations were the main advocates for including these economic and social rights in the international human rights agenda. Delegates of socialist countries, including the Soviet Union and China, also pushed for the principle of the national sovereignty rights over natural resources, which they linked to the abolition of colonialism. This principle has found expression in both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Many of the human rights principles and protections that are now part of the international human rights system were influenced by socialist, economic, and social welfare principles. These principles are most evident in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966. The Covenant deals with many social and economic rights issues, including the right to freely chosen employment and fair working conditions, trade union rights, the rights to social security, the protection of the family and children, the right to adequate standard of living, the freedom from hunger, the right to physical and mental health, the right to education, and the right to enjoy cultural and scientific freedom. These rights provide the most visible evidence of the socialist contribution to the development of international human rights.